The first time my brother called me a liar, it wasn't in private. It was in front of everyone who had come to bury our father. The church fell so quiet that I could hear the rain tapping against the stained glass windows. Every pair of eyes turned toward me as Daniel stepped away from the front pew, his face red with anger. "Don't listen to her," he said, pointing straight at me. "She's making this up because she didn't get what she wanted." A few people looked away. Others stared, waiting for me to defend myself. I couldn't. Not because he was right, but because I was still trying to understand what had just happened. Only an hour earlier, I had believed my father had left us one final message, a letter that explained everything he never had the courage to say while he was alive. Now Daniel was insisting that letter had never existed. He claimed I had forged it. He claimed Dad had changed his will months before he died. And then he looked directly at the attorney standing beside the altar. "Tell them," he demanded. "Tell everyone who inherited the house." The attorney lowered his eyes. "I can only discuss the will with the family after today's service." A murmur swept through the room. I felt my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I noticed my grandmother. She hadn't said a single word all morning. But she slowly reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick, yellow envelope I'd never seen before. She looked at me, then at Daniel. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I hoped I'd never have to open this." In that moment, I realized my father's funeral wasn't the end of our family's story. It was only the beginning. People always say you truly learn who someone is after they're gone. I used to think that was just something people said to make sense of grief. I know now how painfully true it can be. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 12 years working as a high school English teacher in a small town where almost everyone knows everyone else's business. My life wasn't glamorous, but I liked it that way. I loved helping teenagers discover stories that made them feel less alone, and I believed honesty could fix more problems than people realized. My father, Richard Carter, was the person who taught me that. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. He owned a small construction company and believed that a handshake meant something. Growing up, he worked long hours, but he never missed my school plays or Daniel's baseball games. If he promised he'd be there, he showed up. At least, that's how I remembered him. My older brother, Daniel, had always been different from me. Confident, ambitious, and determined to turn every opportunity into profit, he joined Dad's business right after college. While I chose classrooms and books, Daniel chose contracts and clients. Dad used to joke that we had inherited different parts of him. "Emma got my heart," he'd laugh. "Daniel got my stubbornness." Back then, we'd all laugh together. After Mom passed away from cancer 8 years earlier, everything changed without anyone saying it out loud. Dad buried himself in work. Daniel became more involved in the business. I visited every weekend, bringing groceries, helping around the house, and making sure Dad wasn't skipping meals again. He never asked me to. He just smiled every time I showed up. "You're too good to your old man," he'd say. "I learned from the best," I'd answer. Those weekends became our routine. We'd drink coffee on the back porch, argue over baseball scores, and pretend life hadn't become smaller after Mom was gone. Daniel rarely joined us. He always had another meeting, another client, another excuse. I didn't judge him for it. Everyone grieves differently. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. Then, 6 months before Dad died, something shifted. He started asking strange questions. "Emma," he said one evening as we watched the sun disappear behind the trees, "if people you love disappoint you, do you forgive them because they're family, or because you're afraid of losing them?" I laughed awkwardly, thinking he was talking about an old friend. "I guess it depends on what they did." He nodded but didn't explain. Instead, he stared into his coffee for so long that I finally changed the subject. Looking back now, I wish I hadn't. Because that conversation was the first warning. And I completely missed it. Looking back, I realized the truth didn't arrive all at once. It came in small moments that were easy to dismiss. The first was during one of Dad's doctor appointments. He asked me to drive him because his eyesight had been bothering him. As we walked out of the clinic, Daniel pulled into the parking lot. "I've got him from here," he said before I could even open my car door. Dad looked surprised. "I thought you had a meeting." "It got cancelled." I smiled, handed Dad his jacket, and watched them leave. Later that evening, I called to see how he was feeling. Daniel answered Dad's phone. "He's asleep," he said quickly. "I just wanted to check on him." "I already am." His tone wasn't rude. It was final. A few weeks later, Dad invited us both over for Sunday dinner. It used to be our family tradition. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, standing beside the kitchen counter with a stack of papers. As soon as I walked in, he slid them into a folder. Dad noticed me looking. "Just business stuff," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Daniel changed the subject immediately. "So, Emma, still teaching Shakespeare to teenagers?" I laughed politely. "Someone has to." But for the rest of dinner, Dad seemed distracted. Twice I caught him staring at that folder. The next incident bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Dad stopped answering my evening calls. Not every day. Just often enough that it felt unusual. When I finally reached him, he apologized. "Sorry, sweetheart. I've been keeping my phone on silent." That wasn't like him. He never ignored calls from family. A few days later, I stopped by unexpectedly with homemade soup. His phone was sitting on the kitchen table. The ringer wasn't silent. It was turned completely off. Dad noticed me looking. "Oh." He hesitated. I must have hit the wrong button. Before I could ask anything else, Daniel walked in through the back door carrying groceries. He froze for half a second. "I didn't know you were coming." "Neither did I," I replied. The silence between us lasted just a little too long. Then came Dad's birthday. I organized a small dinner with a few close friends and neighbors. Dad looked genuinely happy. For a while. Halfway through dessert, Daniel stood up. "I've got one more gift." He handed Dad a leather folder. Dad opened it, skimmed the pages, and his smile faded. "You want me to sign this tonight?" "It's just paperwork." "Can't it wait?" Daniel lowered his voice. "We've talked about this." Dad closed the folder. "We'll discuss it later." The room suddenly felt colder. No one else understood what had happened. but everyone felt it. After the guests left, I helped clean the kitchen. Dad stood quietly at the sink, washing dishes that were already clean. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded without looking at me. "I'm just tired." "You've seemed worried lately." He dried his hands slowly. "Sometimes." He paused. "Sometimes the hardest part of getting older is realizing people make decisions for you before you're ready." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He forced a smile. "It means your old father is overthinking things." I wanted to believe him. Instead, I hugged him before leaving. He held on a little longer than usual. A month later, Dad was admitted to the hospital after a minor fall. The doctors assured us he would recover, but they recommended he take it easy for a while. I visited every evening after work. One afternoon, the nurse stopped me outside his room. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "Your brother requested that all medical updates go through him." I blinked. "What?" "He said he's handling the family's decisions." I thanked her and walked inside. Dad looked embarrassed. "I didn't know he told them that." "Did you ask him to?" He shook his head. "No." That single word echoed in my mind the entire drive home. For the first time, I stopped wondering if Daniel was simply trying to help. I started wondering what he was trying to control. And I had no idea how much worse it was about to become. Dad came home from the hospital just before Christmas. He insisted on hosting our usual family dinner. "It might not be perfect," he said over the phone, "but traditions matter." I wasn't about to argue with him. When I arrived that evening, the house smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon. Christmas music played softly in the background, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. Dad greeted me with a tired smile. "You made your famous apple pie? You know I never show up without it." He laughed. For the first time in weeks, he actually looked relaxed. Then Daniel arrived. He wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a man in an expensive suit carrying a black leather briefcase. Dad's smile disappeared. "What's this?" he asked. Daniel set a bottle of wine on the table as if nothing was unusual. "Just someone who needs your signature." Dad stared at him. "It's Christmas Eve. It'll only take a minute." The room fell silent. I looked from Dad to the stranger. "I'm sorry," I said. "Who are you?" The man offered a polite smile. "My name is Mr. Collins. I'm here to witness a few legal documents." Dad pushed back his chair. "I told you this could wait." Daniel's voice stayed calm. "Dad, we've already discussed why this is important." "No," Dad replied firmly. "I said I needed more time." Neither of them noticed Grandma quietly watching from the corner of the room. She wasn't eating. She wasn't speaking. She was simply observing. The stranger opened his briefcase anyway. Dad's hands began to shake. I said no. Daniel sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. And you're not listening." I had never heard Dad speak to him that way. Not once. The tension became unbearable. Finally, Dad stood up so suddenly that his chair tipped backward. "I won't sign anything tonight." His voice cracked. "And I won't spend Christmas arguing about my own life." Without another word, he walked upstairs. No one followed him. The lawyer quietly packed his papers. Daniel muttered an apology to the guests before showing the man to the front door. As soon as they left, Grandma looked at me. "Did you see your father's face?" I nodded. "I've never seen him that frightened." She sighed deeply. "Neither have I." That night, while helping clean the dining room, I noticed the leather folder Daniel had left behind on the side table. I wasn't trying to snoop. I only meant to hand it back. But a single sheet had slipped halfway out. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words: "Transfer of residential property ownership." Before I could read another line, Daniel rushed back into the house. He snatched the folder from my hands. "That's private." Our eyes met for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he forced a smile. "I'll see you after the holidays." As he walked away, I looked toward Dad's bedroom window. The light was still on. Something told me he wasn't celebrating Christmas that night. And deep down, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything would work itself out. The next move had to be mine. After Christmas, I stopped asking Daniel questions. Every time I had confronted him before, he'd smiled, changed the subject, or made me feel like I was imagining things. So I decided to do something different. I stayed quiet. For the first time in months, I listened more than I spoke. Dad's health continued to decline, but his mind was still sharp. I visited every Saturday, bringing groceries and helping around the house like I always had. One afternoon, while organizing old photo albums, Dad suddenly asked, "Emma, do you still have the spare key to the house?" "I do." "Good." He nodded without explaining why. It seemed like another strange comment, but after everything that had happened, I had learned not to ignore the little things. A week later, Dad called me just after sunset. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Can you come over?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes." When I arrived, he was sitting alone in the living room. Daniel wasn't there. Dad looked exhausted. "I need a favor." "Anything." He reached into the drawer beside his chair and handed me a small brass key. "This opens the safety deposit box at First County Bank." I stared at it. "Dad, if anything happens to me before we talk again, promise you'll go there." "What are you keeping in it?" He hesitated. "The truth." Before I could ask another question, he squeezed my hand. "Not yet." Those two words stayed with me all the way home. The following week, Daniel called. "I've moved some of Dad's financial paperwork to my office," he said casually. "It'll be easier for me to manage everything." I kept my voice calm. "Did Dad ask you to?" "He doesn't have the energy for all this anymore." That wasn't an answer. But I let the silence hang. Daniel finally said, "Look, I'm just trying to help." "So am I." Neither of us believed the other. I needed advice from someone who wasn't emotionally involved. A colleague at school recommended an estate attorney named Laura Bennett. I made an appointment but didn't tell anyone. After listening carefully, Laura folded her hands on the desk. Your father is still alive? Yes. Then legally, his wishes are what matter, not anyone else's. What if someone's pressuring him? She paused. Pressure can be difficult to prove. I nodded. I understand. But, she continued, if you believe important documents exist, don't wait until they're impossible to find. I left her office feeling both relieved and terrified. For the first time, someone had confirmed I wasn't overreacting. 2 weeks later, Dad's neighbor, Mr. Harris, stopped me as I was getting into my car. Emma. I turned. I don't mean to interfere. He looked uncomfortable. But I've seen people coming and going from your father's house while you're at work. What people? Mostly men in suits. Did my father invite them? I honestly couldn't tell. He lowered his voice. Your dad never looked happy to see them. That conversation replayed in my mind for days. Then came the phone call I had been dreading. Dad had suffered another medical emergency. By the time I reached the hospital, Daniel was already there, talking with the doctor. As soon as he saw me, he stepped into the hallway. They're keeping him overnight. Can I see him? For a few minutes. Inside the room, Dad looked weaker than I'd ever seen him. His eyes opened slowly when he heard my voice. You came. Of course I did. He reached for my hand with surprising strength. The bank. I remember. His breathing became uneven. Promise me. I promise. A nurse entered to check his medication. When I looked back, Dad had closed his eyes again. That was the last full conversation we ever had. 3 days later, my father passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral arrangements happened so quickly that I barely had time to process what had happened. Daniel took charge of almost everything. The flowers. The service. The guest list. Even the obituary. Whenever I offered to help, he simply said, I've already handled it. At the time, I thought he was trying to keep things organized. Now I wonder if he was trying to keep me distracted. The morning before the funeral, I remembered my promise. Instead of driving straight to the church, I stopped at First County Bank. The manager checked my identification, unlocked a private room, and placed a small metal box on the table. My hands trembled as I inserted the brass key. Inside were only 3 things. A sealed envelope with my name written across the front. A flash drive. And a handwritten note from Dad. It read, If you're opening this, then I ran out of time. Trust your grandmother. She knows what I couldn't tell you. And whatever happens next, don't let anger make your decisions. I looked at the envelope for a long time. Every instinct told me to open it immediately. But Dad's words echoed in my mind. Trust your grandmother. So I placed everything back into my bag, locked the box, and drove to the church. I had no idea that within the next hour, my brother would stand in front of everyone, call me a liar, and force Grandma to reveal the one secret our father had protected until his very last day. As soon as the funeral ended, only close family remained inside the church. The attorney, Mr. Reynolds, stood beside a small table with a thick folder in his hands. I know this has been a difficult day, he said quietly. Richard instructed me to read his will immediately after the service. Daniel folded his arms confidently. I noticed he didn't look nervous. He looked prepared. Mr. Reynolds adjusted his glasses and began reading. Dad left me his mother's engagement ring, his collection of first edition books, and enough money to cover several years of savings. I appreciated every word. But something didn't feel right. Then the attorney reached the final page. The family residence and majority ownership of Carter Construction are to pass to Daniel Carter. A heavy silence settled over the room. Daniel slowly exhaled, as if he had been waiting months to hear those exact words. I'm sorry, Emma, he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. I know this isn't what you expected. I looked at him. I wasn't expecting anything. Good. His answer was almost too quick. Then he turned to the attorney. So that's everything? Before Mr. Reynolds could respond, Grandma stood up. No. Every head turned toward her. Her hands shook slightly as she walked toward the front of the room. I've stayed quiet because Richard asked me to. She placed the large yellow envelope on the table. But he also told me that if anyone tried to use the wrong will. She looked directly at Daniel. I was to open this. The room became so still that no one moved. Mr. Reynolds frowned. I've never seen that envelope before. You weren't supposed to. Grandma handed it to him. Richard gave it to me 6 months ago. The attorney carefully broke the seal. Inside was another legal document. Attached to it was a notarized letter signed by Dad. Mr. Reynolds read silently for nearly a minute. His expression changed completely. He looked up at Daniel. When exactly did your father sign the will I just read? Daniel blinked. About 4 months ago. The attorney looked back at the document in his hands. According to this statement, your father revoked that version 2 months later. Daniel's face lost its color. That's impossible. I'm afraid. Mr. Reynolds swallowed. It isn't. The attorney carefully unfolded another page. This is a signed declaration explaining why Richard replaced his previous will. No one interrupted him. I believed I was making responsible decisions while recovering from my illness. However, I later realized I had signed documents without fully reviewing every change. Therefore, I have restored my original estate plan. Daniel took a step forward. That's not enough. Mr. Reynolds looked at him calmly. There are witnesses. He pointed to the signatures at the bottom. Richard's family physician, his longtime accountant, and a notary public. 3 independent witnesses. Daniel's confidence began slipping away. There has to be some mistake. Grandma quietly shook her head. No, Daniel. I reached into my bag. There was something I hadn't shown anyone. Dad's flash drive. I think this belongs here. Mr. Reynolds accepted it. A laptop was brought into the room. The file opened immediately. It was a video. Dad appeared on the screen, sitting in his favorite chair at home. He looked tired, but completely clear-minded. If you're watching this, he began, then my family is probably hurting. He smiled sadly. I wish I were there to stop that. He took a slow breath. I love both of my children equally. Daniel lowered his eyes. But loving someone doesn't mean pretending everything is fine. Dad continued. For months, I've been pressured to transfer my home and business before I felt ready. The room froze. I signed documents because I was exhausted, not because I agreed with every change. He looked directly into the camera. Later, after speaking with my doctor and attorney, I corrected those mistakes. Then came the sentence none of us expected. Daniel, if you're watching this, I hope one day you understand that earning trust is worth more than inheriting property. No one spoke. Not even Daniel. Mr. Reynolds closed the laptop gently. The revised will is legally valid. He paused. The house will not belong solely to Daniel. I held my breath. The residence will be placed into a family trust, exactly as Richard requested. Daniel frowned. A trust? Mr. Reynolds nodded. Neither beneficiary may sell the property without the other's written agreement. Daniel looked stunned. And the business? The company remains under temporary professional management for 1 year. He turned another page. After that, ownership will be shared equally, provided both beneficiaries agree to continue operating it. For the first time all day, Daniel had no response. The victory he thought he had already celebrated had quietly disappeared. But as everyone began gathering their things, Mr. Reynolds looked back at the documents. There is. He hesitated. One final instruction from your father. Every eye turned toward him once again. And something in his voice told me our family's biggest surprise was still waiting to be revealed. No one moved. Mr. Reynolds unfolded the final page and looked around the room before speaking. Richard left one last personal request. He asked that it be read only if there was a disagreement over his estate. He cleared his throat. If my children are arguing over what I leave behind, then I've already failed them. So before anyone signs another paper, I want them to hear me one last time. The room fell silent again. Even Daniel kept his eyes on the floor. Mr. Reynolds continued reading. Emma, thank you for giving me your time when it was the only thing I could never earn back. You never asked me for anything. My chest tightened. Then he read the next lines. Daniel, I know you've worked harder than anyone to grow the business. I've always been proud of that. But somewhere along the way, success became more important than family. Daniel slowly closed his eyes. No one looked at him. No one needed to. The words were doing what anger never could. Grandma stood and walked toward Daniel. She gently placed a hand on his arm. I've watched you carry the weight of proving yourself since you were a boy. Daniel didn't pull away. But your father never asked you to earn his love. His voice finally broke. I thought. He swallowed hard. I thought he didn't trust me anymore. Grandma shook her head. He didn't stop loving you. She looked directly into his eyes. He was afraid you were forgetting who you used to be. Daniel covered his face with both hands. For the first time in years, I didn't see my confident older brother. I saw the scared kid who used to ride his bicycle with me down our neighborhood street. After a long silence, Daniel turned toward me. "I'm sorry." The words came out quietly. I kept telling myself I was protecting Dad and the company. He looked away. But the truth is, I was terrified. I waited. If the business was divided, I thought everything he'd built would fall apart. "So you tried to control everything," I said. He nodded. I convinced myself it was the right thing. I took a slow breath. "I don't think you wanted to hurt me." His eyes filled with regret. "But you did." "I know." There was nothing else to say. Some apologies don't erase the damage. They simply acknowledge it. Mr. Reynolds stepped forward. Richard also left instructions for the company. He handed each of us a folder. "The business will be overseen by an independent manager for the next 12 months. During that time, neither of you may make major financial decisions alone." Daniel gave a small, defeated laugh. "So Dad found one last way to make us work together." "He found one last way," Grandma replied, "to make sure you listen to each other." As everyone prepared to leave, Daniel stopped beside me at the church doors. "The house." I looked at him. "You can move in if you want." I smiled sadly. "That's not what Dad wanted." "I know." He nodded. "I just wanted you to know. I'm done fighting." For the first time since all of this began, I believed him. Not because of what he said. Because of what he didn't. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't making excuses. He was accepting the consequences. Sometimes that's where healing begins. As we stepped outside, the rain had finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds and spread across the churchyard. Grandma slipped her arm through mine. "Your father would be proud of you." I looked toward the sky, thinking of the promise I'd made at the hospital. I had protected the truth. But in the end, the greatest inheritance my father left us wasn't the house or the business. It was one final chance to become a family again. The months after Dad's funeral weren't easy. Healing never is. For a while, Daniel and I spoke only when we had to. Every conversation was about the business, the trust, or paperwork. We kept things polite, but there was still a wall between us. The difference was, neither of us was pretending it wasn't there anymore. The independent manager Dad had chosen turned out to be exactly what we needed. He handled the daily decisions while Daniel and I slowly learned how to work together without competing. For the first time, we listened before we argued. 6 months later, Daniel surprised me. "I've been thinking," he said over coffee. "Dad always wanted scholarships for kids who couldn't afford trade school." I looked at him. "He talked to you about that?" Daniel smiled. "No." He glanced at an old photo of Dad hanging in the office. "I just remembered something he used to say. Success only matters if someone else rises because of it." Together, we created the Richard Carter Memorial Scholarship, helping local students begin careers in construction, engineering, and skilled trades. It wasn't a huge foundation, but it was something Dad would have smiled about. The family home stayed exactly where it had always been. We didn't sell it. Every Sunday, Grandma made lunch there, just as she had for decades. Slowly, those Sunday afternoons stopped feeling like obligations and started feeling like home again. The empty chair at the end of the table never stopped hurting. But it also reminded us why we were there. Not because a will told us to be. Because family was still worth choosing. One afternoon, nearly a year after Dad's passing, I finally opened the sealed envelope he had left in the safety deposit box. Inside was a single handwritten letter. There were no legal instructions. No hidden secrets. Just one page. At the bottom, in the same familiar handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards my entire life, he had written, "Emma, if you're reading this, then you kept your promise. Thank you for protecting our family when I no longer could. Don't spend your future proving who was right. Spend it becoming someone your mother and I would recognize with pride." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. For the first time since losing him, I cried. Not because of what we'd lost, but because I finally understood what he'd been trying to leave us all alone. Years from now, people may forget who inherited the house. They may forget who owned the business. But I'll never forget the lesson my father left behind. The greatest inheritance isn't what someone leaves in a will, it's the character they leave behind in the people who choose to honor it.